Picture a Roman soldier standing at a garrison checkpoint on the edge of the Sahara. 107 BCE. The sun is a physical weight. His sandals are cracked. His shield arm aches from 3 days of border patrol. And in his left hand, pressed against his palm like something precious, is a small linen pouch, not gold, not silver, salt. He will trade that pouch today for bread, for a knife repair, for a debt cleared with another soldier who covered his watch rotation last Tuesday. That pouch is his wage, partially. And every man in his century knows exactly what it's worth, not because someone told them, but because the Roman state engineered it that way. Here is the paradox that drives this entire episode. Salt is one of the most abundant minerals on the surface of this planet. Sodium chloride exists in every ocean, every desert basin, every rock formation from Sicily to the Persian Gulf. It costs almost nothing to extract. And yet, Rome used it to pay armies, control trade routes, build political loyalty, and finance an empire that lasted, in various forms, for over 1,000 years. That is not a coincidence. That is a monetary system. By understanding exactly how Rome transformed a mineral with near zero intrinsic cost into a programmable unit of loyalty and labor, you will understand the precise mechanism modern central banks use when they expand the money supply, printing currency that costs nothing to produce and distributing it to create obligation. The mechanism is identical. Only the material has changed. This episode will prove that the salt ledger was not folklore. It was Rome's first central bank, and the man who ran it answered directly to the Senate. If this kind of financial archaeology, digging through the sediment of history to find the architecture of power, is what you come here for, subscribe now. This is what we do. Let's start with the mechanism, not the mythology. The mechanism. Rome did not simply hand soldiers salt and call it wages. That is a popular simplification that obscures the real engineering. What Rome built was a distribution protocol, a system for converting a state-controlled commodity into a standardized unit of exchange that could function across an empire spanning 3 continents, 12 climate zones, and dozens of languages. To understand this as financial archaeology means stripping away the romance and reading the ledger entries. The Latin word salarium, from which we derive the English word salary, appears in the writings of Pliny the Elder in his Naturalis Historia, completed around 77 CE. Pliny writes that Roman soldiers were paid in part with salt, or were given a monetary allowance specifically designated for its purchase. The distinction matters. Salt was not always the physical payment. Sometimes it was the denominator, the unit of account against which other payments were measured and validated. This is the same structural logic a modern central bank applies when it sets the federal funds rate. The rate itself is not money, but it determines the value of everything denominated in money. Rome controlled salt production through a network of state-managed salt works, salini, concentrated along the Tiber River estuary and along the Adriatic coast. The oldest and most strategically critical was the Salini Ostienses, the salt flats at the mouth of the Tiber, operational from at least the 7th century BCE, as documented by the Roman historian Livy in Ab Urbe Condita. These facilities were not private operations. They were sovereign infrastructure. Rome treated salt production with the same institutional seriousness a modern state applies to its central bank balance sheet. Access was controlled, output was regulated, and distribution was a function of the state apparatus. This is where the hidden economics become visible. Salt's value in the ancient world was not primarily about flavor. It was about preservation. In a world without refrigeration, salt was the only reliable technology for extending the shelf life of meat, fish, and grain across the distances an empire required. An army that could not preserve food could not march. A province that could not preserve grain could not survive a bad harvest. Salt solved a specific, irreplaceable logistical problem, and Rome held the supply. That combination, necessity plus scarcity plus state control, is the 0 point of value, the exact coordinate where a commodity stops being a product and becomes a monetary instrument. Rome enforced the monetary sovereignty of salt through what we would today recognize as supply-side liquidity management. The Senate set the official price of salt, a fixed rate, and periodically flooded or constricted supply to stabilize purchasing power. When the Republic needed to finance military campaigns, it released salt from state reserves, increasing circulation. When inflation threatened to erode the purchasing power of salt-denominated wages, Rome pulled supply back. This is not metaphor. This is the operational logic of a liquidity cycle, the deliberate expansion and contraction of available monetary supply to manage economic pressure. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was the distribution network. Running northeast from Rome to the Adriatic, it predates the Republic itself. Roman armies marched it. Merchants paid tolls to use it. And every toll collected along that road fed directly back into the state treasury, generating fiscal revenue from the act of distribution itself. The infrastructure of salt logistics was simultaneously the infrastructure of Roman taxation. You could not separate them. The road that moved the salt also moved the state's authority. To understand the weight of this in practice, we need to look at the year 264 BCE through the eyes of Marcus Atilius, a common legionary stationed at Messana on the northern tip of Sicily at the opening of the First Punic War. Marcus Atilius does not appear by name in surviving records. He is reconstructed from the unit rosters and pay records that Roman military administration kept with a precision that modern forensic accounting would recognize immediately. The Roman army maintained a document called the Libratio, a balance sheet of individual soldier accounts that recorded wages paid, deductions for equipment and food, and the net balance owed to or by each soldier at the end of each campaign season. Marcus received his stipendium, his base pay, in 3 installments per year. Part of that pay arrived as coin, Roman asses, the standard bronze unit of the Republican monetary system. But a portion of his effective compensation arrived as a salt allowance, either in kind or as a designated purchasing credit against state salt depots that Rome had established at every major garrison point. Here is the critical detail. When Marcus needed to buy bread from a local Sicilian vendor outside the camp, the vendor accepted salt credits because salt was the only commodity he could reliably trade onward. The Sicilian grain merchant 3 towns away accepted salt because it preserved his unsold stock. The salt credit functioned as a currency not because Rome declared it legal tender by law, but because the underlying commodity solved a real problem for every participant in the chain. Trust in the instrument came from trust in the utility of what it represented. That is the psychology of value operating at full efficiency. But Marcus faced a specific risk that modern investors would immediately recognize as counterparty risk. If Rome's salt supply was disrupted by military defeat, by a bad harvest at the salt works, by a Senate decision to divert reserves to another front, his salt allowance would depreciate instantly. The value of his labor already performed could be erased by a decision made 600 miles away in a building he would never enter. His wealth was real, but it was not his to control. This is the structural exposure every worker carries today when their wages are denominated in a currency managed by an institution they did not elect and cannot audit. The Roman system also contained a verification mechanism, an early form of what we would now call immutability. Salt itself is chemically stable. It does not corrode, does not decay, and cannot be counterfeited with available ancient technology. A block of Roman salt from estate Salina was identifiable by its crystalline structure and mineral composition, traceable to its source the way a blockchain transaction is traceable to its originating node. A merchant attempting to pass off inferior or diluted salt as state-grade material faced detection and severe legal consequence under Roman commercial law, specifically under the provisions outlined in the 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code, established around 450 BCE. This immutability gave the system institutional credibility. Everyone who accepted salt as payment knew that the state's quality guarantee stood behind the transaction. The counterparty risk did not sit in the commodity itself. It sat in Rome's continued ability to govern its supply. As long as Rome controlled the salinae, the ledger was sound. And for 3 centuries, Rome did exactly that, until it didn't. What broke the system was not military defeat. It was something far more familiar to anyone who has watched a central bank lose credibility. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome's salt infrastructure was no longer just a logistical network. It was a political instrument, and a small group of Roman families understood something that the average legionary and the average senator did not. Whoever controlled the distribution of salt controlled the velocity of money across the entire empire. Not the production, the distribution. This is the distinction that separates institutional secrets from common knowledge in every era of financial history. Production is visible. Anyone can see a salt works. Anyone can count the output. But distribution, the routes, the contracts, the storage depots, the transport agreements, the access licenses, that is where elite capital management operates. Distribution is the hidden layer. It is the layer where margin is extracted, where political favors are transacted, and where multi-generational wealth is built without leaving a monument. The Roman censors, senior magistrates responsible for public contracts and state asset management, auctioned the salinae management contracts every 5 years to private publicani, tax farming corporations that operated on behalf of the state but retained a percentage of revenues as operating profit. This is sovereign wealth history rendered as a procurement document. The state retained ownership of the salt monopoly, but it outsourced the operational layer, and in doing so, created an arbitrage opportunity that the publicani exploited with systematic precision. Ancient arbitrage in this context worked as follows. A publicanus corporation would win the management contract for, say, the Adriatic salinae at a fixed annual fee paid to the Roman treasury. It then sold salt from those facilities at prices above cost, but below the ceiling set by the Senate's official rate, generating consistent margin on every transaction. Simultaneously, the same corporation would use its exclusive access to state salt depots to supply Roman military garrisons at contract rates, guaranteeing a captive buyer for a fixed volume of output. The risk was minimal, the margin was reliable. The contract renewed every 5 years, providing what modern portfolio managers would recognize as a sovereign-backed annuity, a cash flow stream underwritten by the state's own monopoly enforcement. This structure allowed specific families to accumulate what we now call legacy assets, not just wealth, but institutional position. The right to bid on state contracts was not open to all citizens. It required membership in the equestrian class, the second tier of Rome's property-based social hierarchy. Equestrian status itself required a minimum property assessment, meaning that only families who already held capital could access the contracting system that generated more capital. The system was self-reinforcing by design. Intergenerational wealth defense operated not through inheritance law alone, but through access control baked into the procurement architecture itself. To understand how this power concentration operated at the human level, we need to look at the year 123 BCE through the eyes of the Mancinus family, a documented equestrian clan with recorded salt contracting interests during the Gracchian reform period. The Mancini appear in Roman administrative records in connection with the broader Societas Publicanorum, the corporate consortia that managed state contracts across the late Republic. Their specific involvement in salt distribution is reconstructed from the work of historian Elizabeth Denio, whose studies of Roman client networks and patronage systems document how equestrian families used contracting income to build political relationships that insulated them from legislative reform. In 123 BCE, the tribune Gaius Gracchus proposed a sweeping reform of the publicani contracting system, specifically targeting the Asia Minor tax contracts, which had grown so profitable that they distorted Roman provincial governance. The Gracchian reforms threatened to restructure the bidding process and introduce price transparency that would compress the arbitrage margins the publicani depended on. The Mancinus family's response was not military, it was financial. They redistributed a portion of their salt contract revenues into a network of political loans, extending credit to senators and magistrates whose votes on the reform legislation were undecided. These were not bribes in the modern legal sense. They were instruments of counterparty risk management. By making themselves financially indispensable to the men who controlled the vote, the family converted a political threat into a negotiated outcome. The reforms passed, but the salt contracting structure survived, largely intact, because the families who depended on it had made their survival a precondition of other people's solvency. This is the silent bloodline, not a dynasty of names, but a method, the practice of converting state-adjacent cash flow into political credit, then using political credit to protect the cash flow. It does not require a single family to survive across centuries. It requires only that the method be transmitted, taught to sons, to partners, to the next generation of men who win the next round of contracts. The wealth origins shift. The method persists. The tokenization of salt's value, its conversion from a physical commodity into a unit of account, a credit instrument, a political tool, reached its structural peak under the late Republic. And then Augustus did something that changed the entire architecture. When Augustus reorganized the Roman state after 27 BCE, he did not abolish the salt economy. He consolidated it. Under the Principate, direct imperial administration replaced the publicani contracting system for the most strategic resources, including progressively salt production and distribution along the primary military supply routes. The historian Keith Hopkins, in his landmark work, Taxes and Trade in the Roman Empire, documents how this fiscal centralization transferred control of commodity-backed monetary instruments from equestrian corporate consortia to the imperial household itself. The publicani did not disappear, but their access to the most profitable contracts, the sovereign infrastructure of salt, grain, and metals, was systematically reduced. What had been a distributed network of elite capital management became a concentrated imperial monopoly. The forgotten ledger systems of the Republic were replaced by a single ledger controlled by a single office, the imperial fiscus, the emperor's treasury. That consolidation solved one problem and created another. A distributed system had been resilient precisely because it was distributed. Multiple actors, multiple routes, multiple points of entry. A centralized monopoly was efficient but fragile. When the imperial center weakened, the entire system weakened with it. The debt reset, the moment when a monetary system can no longer honor its implicit obligations, was built into the structure from the moment Augustus made the ledger singular. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman monetary system was under terminal pressure. The silver content of the denarius had been debased to below 5% by successive emperors attempting to finance military campaigns without the tax base to support them. Salt-denominated wage components, already diminishing in relative importance, lost their anchoring function as the currency they supplemented lost purchasing power. The salarium became a historical reference rather than an active instrument. The system did not end with a decree. It ended with the slow erosion of the conditions that had made it function. The formal end of salt as a state monetary instrument in Rome is not recorded as a single legislative event. It dissolved across the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. As the Western Empire fragmented, the Salinae passed into local and eventually ecclesiastical control, and the sophisticated distribution network of the Via Salaria degraded into a regional road maintained by whoever controlled the territory it crossed. The sovereign wealth history of Roman salt did not end in a fire or a default. It ended in administrative entropy, the slow withdrawal of the institutional will required to maintain a monetary system at scale. This is documented in the Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman administrative register compiled around 400 CE, which lists state facilities and their responsible offices. The salt infrastructure that had once occupied a dedicated administrative apparatus appears in the Notitia as a marginal notation, subordinated to broader fiscal offices that no longer treated it as a primary monetary instrument. The ledger had been closed, quietly, without ceremony. Now look at 2026. The structural parallel is not with salt. It is with the condition that made salt powerful. State control of a scarce, necessary commodity whose distribution could be used to create obligation and program loyalty. In 2026, that condition is being reconstructed, not with a mineral, but with digital infrastructure. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are currently in advanced development or active pilot programs in over 130 countries, according to the Atlantic Council's CBDC tracker. The digital yuan, the e-naira, the digital euro pilot framework, each represents a state attempting to do precisely what Rome did with salt: create a monetary instrument whose distribution they control end to end, whose transaction history is immutable and auditable by the issuing authority, and whose terms of use can be programmed at the protocol level. The word programmed is not metaphorical here. CBDC architectures under active design include the technical capacity to set expiration dates on currency, forcing spending within defined windows to manage liquidity cycles. They include the capacity to restrict purchases by category, prohibiting the use of state-issued digital currency for goods the issuing authority designates as outside permitted use. They include the capacity to tie payment access to compliance with state requirements, taxes filed, registrations current, behavior within defined parameters. This is the Salarium rendered in code. The mechanism is structurally identical to what Rome built along the Via Salaria. The state controls the supply, the distribution, the terms of access, and the conditions under which the instrument retains its value. The only difference is that Rome's ledger was written in stone and papyrus, and 2026's ledger is written in cryptographic hash functions on a permissioned blockchain maintained by a central bank. Bitcoin and decentralized monetary systems exist precisely as a response to this architecture, as an attempt to build a monetary instrument whose supply schedule cannot be altered by a Senate vote or an imperial decree, whose ledger is maintained by no single authority, and whose terms of access cannot be programmed by an institution with political objectives. Whether that experiment succeeds at scale remains genuinely open, but its existence as a financial phenomenon is only legible against the background of what Rome built, and what every monetary sovereign since Rome has attempted to rebuild in new materials. Here is what 2,000 years of sovereign wealth history makes clear: the control of the ledger is the control of loyalty. Rome did not pay its soldiers in salt because salt was abundant. Rome paid its soldiers in salt because Rome controlled the supply of salt and therefore controlled the terms on which salt held value. The moment you control the terms on which a currency holds value, you control the behavior of everyone who depends on it. Money doesn't hold value. That's the first lie we're taught. When Rome paid a soldier with salt, he wasn't holding wealth. He was holding a promise guaranteed by the state, which controlled production, distribution, and the rules of acceptance. If Rome lost control of those rules, the salary didn't decrease, it evaporated. Your salary today works exactly the same way. You don't possess value, you possess an obligation issued by a government. What separates your savings from a useless number on a screen is merely a collective agreement. The mechanism hasn't changed in 2,000 years. Whoever controls the ledger controls the behavior of those who depend on it. Rome wrote its ledger in salt and stone. Central banks today write it in interest rates. And the next generation is being written now in programmable digital codes that can be restricted, tracked, or revoked with a click. The material changes. The structure remains. This isn't archaeology. It's the instruction manual for the system we live in today. Next episode, we move east to the caravans crossing the Silk Road in the 9th century CE, where a group of Sogdian merchants developed a credit instrument so sophisticated that it functioned across 6 languages, 4 legal systems, and 2,000 miles of desert without a single state guarantor. The mechanism they built financed the movement of more aggregate wealth than any single empire of the period controlled. We'll show you exactly how it worked. The financial archaeology exists to reveal that the system you live in wasn't born yesterday. It was sculpted through centuries of power experiments. If you want to stop looking only at the numbers and start reading the intentions behind them, this is your place. Subscribe to understand the code that moves the world. If the government can dictate how and when you spend your money, is it still truly yours? To what extent would you accept this? Leave your opinion in the comments. There is no clean answer here, and that is exactly why it matters.